This morning, you probably bought something. Maybe a coffee, maybe a small item, or perhaps you simply touched your phone screen and what you wanted was already on its way to you before you even realized it. Because money exists, and money makes everything easier. But before money was invented, it almost seems impossible to understand how people managed to make progress at all. Otherwise, humanity could never have survived until today. They had to find ways to secure food, make tools, protect themselves and survive. But how? The answer is far more complicated and far more human than what economics books usually describe. But first, let me tell you about a myth. Most people have probably heard this story before. Before money existed, humans used a barter system, something like you give me fish and I'll give you a knife. Over time, this system supposedly became too complicated and eventually money was invented. Honestly, it sounds believable. Simple, clean, a straightforward story of progress. But there's one problem. This story may be completely wrong. Anthropologist David Graeber examined nearly 200 years of anthropological research for his book Debt, the first 5,000 years, and found something surprising. No society based purely on barter, where people only exchanged goods directly with one another, has ever been documented anywhere, at any time. Caroline Humphrey reached an even sharper conclusion. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described. All available ethnography suggests that there never has been such a thing, and that pushes us into an even deeper mystery. So how did people trade without money? The first system was the gift economy. It sounds strange, but that's how it worked. Our ancestors were not trading, they were giving gifts. But this idea goes much deeper than it first appears. In small, tightly connected communities, camps of roughly 20 to 50 people, individuals were not separated from one another. They shared everything. A hunter catches several deer, but he cannot eat all of it himself, so he gives the rest to the group. There were no calculations, no receipts, no prices. There was only one thing: expectation. A silent, unconscious, but very real expectation. One day, you will give too. One day, when someone else is in need, they will do the same for others, just as it was once done for them. Anthropologists call this reciprocity. And this system functioned for thousands of years without money, something that feels almost impossible to imagine today. But how could such a system actually work? The answer is simple. Everyone knew each other intimately, down to the smallest detail. Everyone lived in full view of everyone else. Being selfish, taking without giving back, meant social disappearance, and being excluded from the group in that era essentially meant the end of a person's life. Trust was the value that replaced money in those times. Now let's move to the second system, debt and obligation. So how did exchange work in larger communities? This is where things become truly interesting and strangely complex. Money did not exist, yet in a way it did. Imagine your neighbor has a cow and you do not. You are going to starve. Your neighbor gives you the cow, but this is not a sale, it is a debt. When will you repay it? Unclear. How will you repay it? Also unclear. But you owe something now, and that debt, that unspoken declaration, creates a bond between two people. This is exactly what David Graeber discovered. Long before money appeared, complex systems of credit already existed. People owed things to one another, and those debts could sometimes last for generations. Sometimes they were repaid with cattle, sometimes through arranged marriages, and sometimes simply through acts of kindness. But they were repaid. Money was not invented to simplify exchange. According to Graeber's argument, money emerged largely to organize and support these systems, especially for states that needed to collect taxes. In other words, money was not just enabling trade, it was maintaining the system itself. The third system was long-distance trade. And honestly, this is where things become truly surprising. Around 300,000 to 320,000 years ago, during the very earliest known period of modern humans, people living in the Ologsale region of Kenya were working with obsidian tools that came from sources located 50 to 150 kilometers away. So what is obsidian? It is volcanic glass, and it naturally produces some of the sharpest edges found in nature. In fact, an obsidian blade can be sharper than a modern surgical scalpel, and these people were transporting it across enormous distances. But this was not simple trade in the modern sense. So how was it happening? Researchers believe that kinship ties, marriage alliances, and friendships between groups allowed these materials to move across region. In other words, you bring obsidian to another group, and they give you ochre, a red pigment stone, in return. But this was not based on fixed prices or a formal market system. The value depended entirely on how each side perceived the exchange. There is more evidence as well. In South Africa, 30,000-year-old ostrich eggshell beads have been discovered more than 300 kilometers away from where they were originally made. These objects were not merely traded. Many were likely passed from group to group as gifts, helping maintain relationships over long distances. In those ancient times, trade was diplomacy before it was economics. The fourth system was specialization and barter. If you think specialization did not exist before money, you would be mistaken. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia shows that as early as 6000 BCE, people were already specializing in different kinds of work. There were fishermen, farmers, toolmakers, and many other professions. And yes, they did engage in barter. But this is exactly where the classic barter story begins to fall apart. Economists call it the double coincidence of wants problem, a strange but very real issue. Imagine you're a fisherman and you need a knife. You go to the toolmaker, but the toolmaker does not need fish. Then what happens? No agreement can be reached because both sides do not want what the other is offering at the same time. This problem truly existed, and it was a serious one. But humans found surprisingly clever ways to overcome it. The fifth system was commodity money. Before money was officially invented, certain goods had already begun functioning like money. In Mesopotamia, wheat and barley became standard measures of value. In Egypt, grain records played a similar role. In China, people used salt and tea. In North America, wampum, shell beads, became widely recognized, while in West Africa, cloth served a similar purpose. These goods shared important characteristics that made them useful as a standard of value. Everyone needed them. They could be transported, divided into smaller amounts, and stored without quickly spoiling. And now something very interesting began to happen. These goods created a common language that everyone could understand. Maybe the toolmaker did not want fish, but he did want wheat. So you trade your fish for grain first, and then use the grain to obtain the knife. This was the final step before the birth of money itself. When you see, the sixth system was tally sticks and the first records. Now let's talk about something very few people know about: tally sticks. These marks carved into bone or wood were among the earliest accounting tools in human history. What makes this especially fascinating is that similar systems appeared independently in England, China, and throughout the Maya world. According to a 2025 study by Anthropology professor Robert Rosenzweig from the University at Albany, these tally systems shared a common function. They helped organize state debts and tax obligations. In other words, money did not emerge because barter systems failed. It emerged because societies needed a way to track debts, obligations, and payments more efficiently. The invention of money was driven by a very different need than most people imagine. And that reveals one of the greatest misconceptions in the history of economics. Now think about this. Before money was invented, for thousands of years humans built complex economic systems. They gave gifts, they accumulated debts, they transported goods across hundreds of kilometers, they specialized and even developed shared systems of value. And they sustained all of this with just one thing: trust. The only functioning system everyone had to follow. Not banks, not formal contracts, not written laws. Just trust. And this is what allowed their societies to survive. Because in small communities, supporting trust meant supporting everything. That is why people spent centuries making promises to one another, becoming indebted to each other, and giving gifts. Money then simplified the system, but it also took something away, something very important for human life: trust. From that point on, relationships became more impersonal and less direct, and social bonds gradually changed in character. This evening, you will go to a supermarket. The proteins you buy will have been produced by people you do not know. The money that finances them will have come from systems you never personally interact with. You may not even make eye contact with the cashier. And this process, this completely cold, impersonal system, will continue without interruption. Because money exists, and money has largely replaced trust and neighborly exchange. But for 300,000 years there was a face behind every exchange. There was a name, and most importantly, there was a relationship. Maybe the real question is this: while we simplified the system, do we fully understand what we lost along the way?